There exists a place that few in the modern world still recognize, a threshold so delicate and gossamer thin that it trembles between the seen and unseen. It lives not in distant mountains or forgotten forests, but here, in the very heart of your home, in the space behind the stove, where heat still radiates from ancient bricks, in the shadows of the basement, where earth and wood meet in perpetual darkness. This is the realm where one of humanity's oldest guardians has dwelled for countless generations, watching, protecting, and sometimes punishing with a severity that would chill the blood of the unprepared. We do not often speak of household spirits in the modern age. Our contemporary world has displaced such beliefs to the realm of superstition, dismissed them as folklore suitable only for children's stories or anthropological curiosity. Yet in the rural corners of Russia, in villages where the winter still stretches for half the year, and where traditions run deeper than the permafrost beneath the earth, these ancient beliefs persist with a vitality that defies our rational age. The Domovoi, Russia's primordial house spirit, remains not merely a memory, but a living presence in the consciousness of millions who continue to acknowledge his existence, respect his iya, and navigate the complex relationship between household and inhabitant that he represents. The Domovoi embodies one of humanity's most profound psychological truths. Our homes are not merely physical structures of wood and stone, but liminal spaces where the boundary between order and chaos, safety and danger, remains perpetually contested. Before we venture deeper into the mystery of this spirit, I invite you to think carefully about your own dwelling. Consider the creaks at night that have no explanation, the objects that go missing only to reappear in impossible locations, or the inexplicable sense of presence when you are alone. These are not necessarily supernatural phenomena, but they are the very experiences that Russian tradition has always attributed to the watchful eye of the Domovoi. Before we continue, I must ask you to join us on this journey by subscribing to Echoes of the Old World, where we explore the spirits and beliefs that have shaped human consciousness across continents and centuries. This channel is dedicated to unraveling the mysteries hidden within folklore, examining the profound truths that ancient peoples encoded within their supernatural traditions. By subscribing, you ensure that you will not miss a single revelation about the spiritual world that our ancestors knew intimately and that still whispers at the edges of our collective memory. The study of household spirits reveals something essential about human itself. Every culture that has ever established a permanent dwelling has created mythology around that dwelling. The Romans had their lares and penates, the Japanese their kami of the hearth, the Germanic peoples their housegeist, and the Slavic world gave birth to the Domovoi, a figure so deeply embedded in Russian culture that his existence transcends the boundary between mythological and cultural fact. To understand the Domovoi is to understand not merely an abstract supernatural entity, but a mirror reflecting how one ancient civilization conceptualized the tensions, responsibilities, and sacred obligations inherent in maintaining a home. The traditions surrounding the Domovoi are not static historical artifacts preserved in amber, but rather living practices that continue to evolve even in the 21st century. Farmers in remote regions of Russia still perform rituals of welcome when moving into a new property. Grandmothers continue to warn children against whistling indoors, a prohibition that exists nowhere in the codified rules of household management. But everywhere in the whispered knowledge passed from generation to generation, offerings of bread and milk still appear in certain households, left in specific locations not as meals for flesh and blood inhabitants, but as acknowledgements of a presence that requires recognition and respect. Before we descend deeper into the specifics of this spirit's appearance, habitat, and temperament, I ask you to share your thoughts in the comments below. From where are you watching this video? What drew you to this exploration of Russian folklore? Have you experienced unexplained phenomena in your own home that might find explanation within these ancient traditions? Your perspectives from different parts of the world enrich our collective understanding of how universal themes of household guardianship manifest across diverse cultures. The conversation that forms in your responses becomes part of the living tradition we are exploring together. The Domovoi cannot be understood apart from the Russian concept of home itself. The Russian word for home, dom, is not merely a structure, but a complete universe encompassing family, history, responsibility, and the sacred obligation to maintain order against the encroaching chaos of the wilderness that surrounds civilization. The Domovoi is, in essence, the guardian of this sacred space, but also its judge and enforcer of its laws. He is neither wholly beneficent nor entirely malevolent, but rather a complex, supernatural being whose reflects the complexity of domestic life itself. He punishes laziness, disrespect, and negligence because these threaten the stability of the household that he has sworn to protect. What makes the Domovoi particularly fascinating is that he cannot be categorized within simple frameworks of good and evil. He is not a demon sent to torment, nor is he an angel assigned to comfort. He is something far older and more primal, a manifestation of household consciousness itself, an embodiment of the invisible forces that bind family members together and hold them accountable to the standards they have established within their walls. To enter a Russian home is to enter a space where the spirit's presence is acknowledged, however subtly, however unconsciously, in the way family members conduct themselves, in the respect afforded to the hearth, in the care taken to maintain the boundary between inside order and outside chaos. As we embark on this journey through the mythology of the Domovoi, we will examine not merely the folklore itself, but the profound truths about human psychology, family dynamics, and our relationship with the spaces we inhabit that this ancient tradition continues to illuminate. We will explore his appearance, his dwelling places, his protective functions, and the terrible punishments he metes out to those who fail to honor the sacred compact between household and inhabitant. We will discover how this spirit has survived centuries of Christianity, industrialization, and modernization, and why his relevance has never truly diminished. The Domovoi is not merely a figure of the past, but a living psychological principle that continues to shape how we understand home, family, and the invisible forces that govern domestic life. To describe the Domovoi is to venture into territory where the line between concrete physical detail and psychological impression becomes impossible to define with precision. Those who claim to have encountered him, and there are still Russians, particularly in rural regions, who insist on the reality of such meetings, describe a being so utterly distinctive that he cannot be confused with any other figure in the vast pantheon of Slavic supernatural entities. Yet simultaneously, accounts from different regions, different centuries, and different families reveal a consistency so profound that it speaks to something beyond mere folklore repetition, something suggesting that generations of believers were describing the same fundamental reality, filtered through individual perception and cultural memory. The Domovoi is, first and foremost, small, not the diminutive stature of a child, but rather the compressed form of an ancient human, condensed into a frame no more than 2 to 3 feet in height. This smallness is crucial to understanding his eyes, for it places him below eye level, allowing him to move through households in the spaces that humans typically overlook or ignore. He exists in the architectural gaps where dust accumulates and spiders build their webs, in the shadowed corners where brooms cannot easily reach, in the gaps between floorboards where small objects fall and vanish into forgotten darkness. His stature renders him invisible, not through magical means, but through the simple reality that adult humans rarely scrutinize the spaces where small things dwell. The most consistent and striking feature of the Domovoi across all recorded descriptions is his overwhelming hairiness. He is not merely bearded, as one might describe an old man with a prominent beard, but rather entirely covered in coarse matted hair that seems to be the dominant feature of his entire form. This hair is universally described as dark, thick, and wild, suggesting a being who exists outside the grooming standards of civilized humanity. Some accounts describe this hair as black as night, others as brown as the earth itself, but all agree that it covers his body almost completely, including his arms and legs, giving him an aspect more akin to an animal than a human. The hair of his head and beard flow together in an undifferentiated mass, creating an appearance of simultaneous ancientness and primal vitality. The face of the Domovoi, insofar as it can be discerned beneath this profusion of hair, bears the marks of extreme age, combined with an unsettling vitality. His eyes, visible through the darkness of his facial hair, are consistently described as penetrating and intelligent, conveying an awareness that transcends ordinary animal consciousness. These are the eyes of a being who watches perpetually, who misses nothing occurring within the household, who judges and evaluates the conduct of those who share his dwelling. They are not the gentle eyes of a benevolent protector, nor are they the malevolent eyes of a demon seeking destruction, but rather the impassive, measuring gaze of a judge who observes without sentimentality. Some witnesses have claimed that his eyes glow faintly in darkness, or that they reflect light in an unnatural manner, though such details may represent the embellishments memory applies to genuinely inexplicable experiences. Accounts from different regions of Russia reveal subtle but significant variations in the Domovoi's appearance that reflect local environmental conditions and architectural traditions. In the northern reaches, where winters are more severe and houses built more heavily against the cold, descriptions tend to emphasize the Domovoi's squat, powerful build and his hair as matted and ice-like. In central Russia, where traditional architecture incorporated more wood and internal spaces developed differently, witnesses describe a more elongated form with hair that seems to ripple like wheat fields in wind. Southern descriptions, influenced by different agricultural practices and architectural styles, occasionally depict the Domovoi as smaller and more refined, his hair less wild, though no less complete. Yet beneath these regional variations lies a consistency so fundamental that one cannot help but suspect that what differs is not the being itself, but rather how human perception interprets and describes what the mind struggles to fully process. The age of the Domovoi is paradoxical and unsettling. He appears simultaneously ancient and eternally vital, as if he contains within himself centuries or perhaps millennia of accumulated existence. His face, visible through the darkness of his beard, shows the weathering of impossible age, lines etched into his features, a gauntness suggesting lifetimes of observation. Yet his movements are described as quick and precise, those of a being whose physical vitality has never diminished. This combination of extreme age and preserved power is profoundly disquieting, suggesting a form of existence fundamentally different from human aging, as if the Domovoi exists in a time frame so vastly extended that the passage of decades means nothing to him. Regional folklore provides additional details that, while less universally agreed upon, appear with sufficient frequency to warrant consideration. Some accounts mention that the Domovoi possesses a tail, short and stubby, visible only when he moves quickly or when observed in certain light conditions. Others describe him as having hooved feet or feet shaped like an animal's paw, suggesting a kinship with the wild world that lies beyond the boundaries of human cultivation. The most specific accounts mention that he wears a red or white tunic, suggesting that even a being fundamentally wild and hirsute maintains some connection to human cultural practices. These details, whether literally true or symbolic representations of deeper truths about his emphasize that the Domovoi occupies a liminal position between human and animal, between civilization and wilderness. What strikes the observer most profoundly about attempts to describe the Domovoi's appearance is not the specific details, but rather the testimony that he seems to project a presence that overwhelms physical description. Those who claim to have seen him report not merely the fact of his appearance, but the overwhelming impression of ancientness, of watching, of judgment. His physical form seems to carry with it an invisible weight of intention and awareness that transcends the mere physical body. He appears less as a curious creature to be catalogued, and more as a force that has assumed physical form, a condensation of household consciousness given tangible reality. Across centuries and across the vast expanse of Russian territory, this portrait has remained fundamentally consistent, altered only in details, while the essential character remains recognizable. The small, incredibly hairy figure, with the penetrating gaze, and the demeanor of an ancient judge has persisted in human memory and description through changes in religion, politics, technology, and social structure. This consistency across time and space suggests that the Domovoi represents something far deeper than a mere folklore creation. He embodies an archetype of household guardianship that transcends individual culture and speaks to something universal in human consciousness. To understand where the Domovoi dwells is to understand something fundamental about Russian domestic architecture and the spiritual geography that underlies it. The stove, not merely a cooking apparatus, but the absolute center of Russian household life for centuries, occupies a role so central to domestic existence that one cannot overstate its significance. This is not simply furniture, not merely a source of heat during the brutal Russian winters, but rather the literal and metaphorical heart of the home, the place around which family life has orbited since the earliest settlements of the Slavic peoples. Behind this stove, in the narrow space between brick and wall where heat continues to radiate even hours after the fire has cooled, the Domovoi maintains his primary residence, watching the household with the patience of someone for whom time moves differently than it does for mortal inhabitants. The Russian stove, known as the pech, is an architectural marvel that occupies a place of honor in traditional houses that can only be understood through the lens of its historical and spiritual importance. These are not small cooking devices, but rather enormous brick structures that dominate the interior space of the izba, the traditional Russian peasant dwelling. The pech provides warmth in winter through its radiating mass, cooks the family's food, and often serves as a sleeping place where family members would climb onto its heated surface to rest during the coldest nights. The construction of a new pech was an event of profound importance, requiring craftsmen with specialized knowledge passed down through generations, and it was understood that in building this structure, one was not merely creating a physical apparatus, but establishing a covenant with the household spirit that would inhabit it. The space immediately behind the pech holds a significance that transcends its mere physical dimensions. It is neither fully integrated into the household's living spaces, nor completely separate, existing in a liminal zone where the boundary between human and non-human territory blurs into ambiguity. This area accumulates a particular kind of warmth, not the direct heat of the stove's surface, but rather a gentler, more pervasive warmth that gradually dissipates into the surrounding air. In the darkness of this space, protected from the direct observation of household members, the Domovoi maintains what might be understood as his personal quarters, a sanctuary from which he emerges to conduct his various duties as household guardian. The very architecture of the traditional Russian home seems designed with the Domovoi in mind, as if builders instinctively created a space for his habitation while consciously engaging in the work of construction. Regional variations in stove design and house layout create subtly different environments for the Domovoi's residents, yet the fundamental principle remains constant across Russian territory. In the far north, where the intensity of winter requires massive stoves that occupy enormous portions of the interior space, the Domovoi's behind-stove habitat becomes correspondingly larger and more elaborate. In central Russia, where traditional architecture incorporated different spatial arrangements, the space behind the stove might be more confined, creating a cozier refuge. Southern Russian designs, influenced by warmer climates and different building traditions, sometimes position the stove differently, yet still maintain the principle of a protected space where the Domovoi can establish his residence. What remains universal is that the Domovoi's choice of this specific location represents an acknowledgement of the stove's central role in family life and his commitment to protecting the source of the household's warmth and nourishment. Yet the Domovoi is not confined to this primary residence. Russian folklore consistently describes him as inhabiting multiple locations within the home, moving through the household with freedom and purpose, appearing where his attention is required. The basement or cellar, the podyol in Russian architectural terminology, represents his secondary residence, equally significant to his and equally important to understanding his role within the household ecosystem. If the space behind the stove represents the Domovoi's connection to warmth, to family gathering, and to the domestic center of household life, then the basement represents his connection to the earth itself, to the foundation upon which human habitation rests, to the storage of provisions, and the preservation of what the household has accumulated through its labor. The basement is fundamentally different from the living spaces above it. It is cooler, darker, and permeated by a quality of dankness that speaks to its proximity to earth and sometimes to groundwater. In traditional Russian homes, the basement served as storage for foodstuffs, potatoes, cabbage, preserved foods that would sustain the family through the months when the frozen earth above prevented cultivation or gathering. It is a liminal space between the human world above and the geological world below, between light and darkness, between warmth and cold. The Domovoi's presence in this location speaks to his role as protector of the household's sustenance, as guardian of the provisions that mean the difference between survival and starvation during the brutal Russian winter. His inhabitation of the basement represents his commitment to ensuring that nothing spoils, that nothing is wasted, that the family's stores remain secure against both physical decay and supernatural theft. The relationship between these two habitats, behind the warm stove and in the cool basement, reveals something profound about the Domovoi's and his understanding of domestic balance. He is not confined to either location, but rather moves between them, conducting his various duties, monitoring different aspects of household function. Some accounts describe him as traveling through walls and between levels using pathways unknown to ordinary humans, appearing suddenly in unexpected locations as circumstances require his intervention. This mobility within the home's interior spaces, his ability to move through the structure as if it were transparent to him, suggests a spiritual connection to the dwelling itself that transcends normal physical limitations. The Domovoi is not merely a being who happens to inhabit these spaces. He is fundamentally integrated into the home's structure, connected to its integrity and function at a level that borders on the metaphysical. Why these specific locations hold such profound significance becomes clearer when one considers the essential functions of the traditional Russian home. The stove provides heat and cooks food. The basement stores and preserves provisions. Together, they encompass the two central concerns of survival in a harsh climate: maintaining warmth against lethal cold, and securing adequate food against the threat of starvation. By establishing his residences at these two critical nodes of household function, the Domovoi positions himself as the guardian of the home's survival itself. His watchfulness over these spaces represents his commitment to ensuring that the household endures, that the family remains warm and fed, that the fundamental conditions of survival are maintained through his constant vigilance. To protect the stove and the basement is, in Russian traditional understanding, to protect the entire household and all its inhabitants. The folklore surrounding these habitats emphasizes repeatedly that the Domovoi maintains absolute territorial authority over these spaces. Just as a human householder would not permit strangers to rummage through the basement or to interfere with the stove, the Domovoi demands that his domains be respected and that no one ventures into these spaces carelessly or with disrespect. Disturbance of the stove's immediate surroundings or careless behavior in the basement can trigger his wrath as readily as disrespect toward family members or negligence in household duties. These spaces are not merely his residences. They are sacred precincts where his authority is absolute and where the separation between his world and the human world becomes particularly thin and vulnerable to breach. To understand the Domovoi as merely a spirit of punishment and terror would be to fundamentally misrepresent this being, and to ignore the vast body of testimony from Russians who experienced him primarily as a protector, guardian, and source of household prosperity. The duality that defines his character cannot be overstated. He is simultaneously the potential source of affliction and the steadfast guardian against misfortune, the enforcer of household standards, and the shield against external dangers that threaten family well-being. For centuries, Russian families understood that living in harmony with their Domovoi transformed him from a potential adversary into an invaluable ally, a supernatural presence whose commitment to household welfare transcended ordinary human capacity for vigilance and care. Those who maintained proper respect and conducted themselves with integrity within their homes often testified to experiencing protection so profound and consistent that it seemed impossible to attribute to mere coincidence or natural cause. The protective functions ascribed to the Domovoi extend across nearly every dimension of household existence, encompassing physical safety, economic security, and the maintenance of family harmony. He watched over sleeping family members, detecting dangers that mortal senses might fail to perceive, and awakening them through gentle disturbance when genuine threats approached. Accounts describe families being saved from house fires through the Domovoi's intervention, a sudden awakening minutes before flames would have become lethal, an urgent pulling at blankets that dragged a sleeping person from harm's way. He protected against intruders and thieves, his presence in the home serving as a deterrent so effective that many families reported never experiencing theft or burglary across generations. Despite living in regions where such crimes were common, the Domovoi became, in essence, the household's invisible security system, operating continuously through the day and night with a dedication that no hired guardian could match. Beyond protection from external threats, the Domovoi's benevolent functions extended deeply into the economic life of the household, ensuring that resources remained secure and that the family's prosperity did not diminish through negligence or misfortune. He watched over the stores in the basement with particular vigilance, protecting foodstuffs from premature spoilage, pest infestation, and decay. Families reported that food stored under the Domovoi's watchful gaze remained fresh far longer than should have been physically possible. That grain did not develop the molds that commonly plagued stored provisions, and that the family's stores seemed to stretch further than the actual quantity stored should logically have permitted. This was not understood as magical multiplication of resources, but rather as the Domovoi's careful stewardship, his prevention of waste through mysterious means that transcended ordinary household management. He maintained the integrity of the household's economic foundation, ensuring that the labor invested in food production, preservation, and storage was not squandered through forces beyond human control. The Domovoi's role as keeper of prosperity extended further still into the realm of livestock and agricultural production. He maintained particular relationships with the family's horses and cattle, attending to their welfare with an attention that sometimes rivaled that of human caretakers. Families consistently reported that livestock living under a Domovoi's protection remained healthier and more productive than animals belonging to households where the spirit was neglected or disrespected. Horses that might have gone lame grew strong. Cattle that might have fallen ill remained vigorous and fertile. Chickens laid more abundantly, and birds seemed to flourish under conditions that would have caused them to suffer. The Domovoi's relationship with these animals was understood as something approaching affection, though mediated through his fundamental commitment to household prosperity, rather than through ordinary sentiment. His care for the livestock represented an extension of his protective mandate, recognizing that the family's animals were integral to household survival and economic well-being. Accounts from rural Russia describe situations where the Domovoi's benevolent interventions saved families from financial ruin or catastrophic loss. When a particular cow was sick to the point of death, the Domovoi sometimes appeared in the barn and spent the night tending to the animal. Its recovery beginning the moment his supernatural care commenced. When grain stores were threatened by rats or moths, families reported waking to find that the Domovoi had somehow driven these pests away, the infestation ceasing entirely after a single night of his intervention. When a family faced winter with inadequate provisions, stories circulated of the Domovoi making their stores stretch impossibly, of portions somehow yielding more nourishment than their quantity should have provided, of a family reaching spring without suffering the malnutrition that seemed inevitable in early winter. These accounts, passed down through generations and appearing across different regions of Russia with remarkable consistency, suggest that families genuinely experienced the Domovoi as a supernatural entity whose commitment to household prosperity was tangible and measurable. The Domovoi's maintenance of household harmony extended beyond material prosperity to encompass the emotional and relational dimensions of family life. He was said to intervene subtly in family disputes, preventing conflicts from escalating into destructive rage through mysterious interventions that turned heated arguments into manageable disagreements. Accounts describe situations where a Domovoi might cause an angry family member to become suddenly drowsy or distracted, interrupting the momentum of a quarrel before genuine damage could occur. He seemed to sense when family members were approaching dangerous emotional states and would gently redirect their attention or their mood through means that appeared accidental, but that family members eventually recognized as purposeful intervention. This aspect of his protective function speaks to a sophisticated emotional intelligence and a commitment to household welfare that transcends the mere prevention of physical harm, extending to the preservation of family relationships themselves. Particularly fascinating are accounts of the Domovoi's protection of children, treated by the spirit with what can only be described as particular tenderness, despite his capacity for frightening punishment. Families reported that small children seemed to receive enhanced protection from danger, that toddlers who might have fallen into fire or water were mysteriously prevented from such catastrophes, and that childhood illnesses that killed many children seemed to spare those living in households where the Domovoi was revered and respected. Mothers testified to sensing his presence when they were exhausted or overwhelmed, feeling that an additional guardian had taken watch during the night so they could rest. The relationship between the Domovoi and the family's children represents one of the most touching aspects of Russian folklore, revealing that even a being capable of terrible punishments possessed a capacity for protection and care that bordered on the parental. The profound of the Domovoi's protection can only be fully appreciated when one recognizes that this spirit was not understood as responding to prayers or invocations in the manner of saints or religious figures. Rather, his protection flowed naturally from his fundamental commitment to household integrity and family welfare, operating continuously whether or not family members explicitly requested it. The relationship was understood as contractual in a deep sense. The family maintained the household with cleanliness and respect, conducted themselves with propriety within its walls, and the Domovoi responded by extending his protection across every dimension of household existence. This was not charity or generosity in the religious sense, but rather a reciprocal arrangement between those who inhabited the space and the supernatural being whose charge it was to maintain that space's integrity and security. The Domovoi's presence within the household is not confined to the material dimensions of protection and provision that characterize his more tangible interventions. A significant aspect of his role involves communication with the family members who share his dwelling, transmitting warnings of impending danger and conveying messages about household matters through channels that exist at the boundary between the physical and the supernatural. These communications are rarely explicit or unambiguous. Instead, they manifest as a complex language of signs, sounds, disturbances, and impressions that require interpretation and cultural knowledge to properly understand. Russian families developed sophisticated frameworks for decoding these supernatural messages, learning to recognize patterns in seemingly random occurrences, and to extract genuine warnings from the ambient noise and movement that characterizes any living household. The most common method through which the Domovoi communicates danger or concern involves various forms of auditory phenomena that occur when the household is quiet and family members are most attentive to their surroundings. A family might hear unexplained knockings on walls or wooden surfaces, sometimes following rhythmic patterns that suggest intentionality rather than the settling of an old structure or the movement of animals within walls. These knocks were understood not as random noise, but as the Domovoi's attempt to capture attention and direct it toward potential problems. The location of the knocking carried significance. A knock emanating from the basement might indicate spoilage in the stores or the presence of vermin, while sounds originating from the kitchen could signal problems with the stove or the need for maintenance in that area of the house. Family members learned to correlate the location and intensity of these auditory disturbances with specific household concerns, developing an intuitive understanding of the Domovoi's warning system over generations of shared residence. Beyond simple knocking sounds, the Domovoi occasionally produced more complex auditory phenomena designed to communicate specific warnings or concerns. Families reported hearing what could only be described as sighs or groans emanating from the spaces behind walls or beneath floorboards, sounds that conveyed an impression of concern or distress. These vocalizations were not frightening in the manner of a demon's roar, but rather carried a quality of anxious communication, as if the Domovoi were attempting to express something urgent in the only manner available to him. Some accounts describe hearing what seemed to be whispered words or indecipherable speech patterns, never quite articulate enough to be understood as language, but carrying the unmistakable impression of intentional communication. The tone and quality of these sounds provided emotional context. A gentle whisper might indicate a minor concern requiring attention, while more urgent or distressed sounds conveyed the seriousness of whatever threat or problem the Domovoi sought to communicate. Physical disturbances within the household served as additional channels through which the Domovoi expressed his warnings and concerns about household matters. Objects might be moved from their customary locations, not in the chaotic manner of supernatural poltergeist activity, but rather in purposeful ways that drew attention to specific areas or problems. A cup placed pointedly on the edge of a shelf seemed designed to catch the eye and direct attention toward the shelf itself or the area it occupied, perhaps indicating spoilage in stored goods or the need for inspection of that particular space. Tools might be found arranged in unusual patterns, or items moved to locations where family members would inevitably discover them during normal household activities. These physical rearrangements seemed calculated to intrigue and puzzle rather than to frighten, serving as a supernatural nudge, directing human attention toward matters requiring investigation. Dreams and visions represented another important channel through which the Domovoi communicated warnings to family members, particularly during periods when direct physical warnings seemed insufficient. Family members would report experiencing unusually vivid dreams that felt qualitatively different from ordinary sleep visions, carrying a clarity and directness that suggested their source lay outside normal psychological processes. In these dreams, the Domovoi sometimes appeared in his characteristic form, small and bearded, though always with an expression of urgency or concern rather than malevolence. He might gesture towards specific locations in the house, point out potential dangers, or communicate warnings about traveling or economic decisions in ways that could be recalled upon waking with surprising precision. The most significant of these dream communications seemed to occur when the family faced imminent danger that required urgent action. A warning dream might precede a fire, the arrival of bandits, or the development of illness that required immediate treatment. The manifestation of the Domovoi's concern sometimes took more subtle forms that operated at the threshold between conscious observation and intuitive knowledge. Family members reported experiencing suddenly intensified feelings of unease or anxiety when the household faced danger, or when some problem required attention. Feelings that seemed to arise not from personal worry, but from an external source of influence. A mother might develop an overwhelming compulsion to check on a sleeping child moments before that child became dangerously ill, an urgency that felt imposed from outside her ordinary maternal concern. A householder might experience an irresistible urge to inspect the stove or the basement, only to discover upon investigation that genuine danger existed. A structural weakness beginning to develop, stored grain beginning to spoil, or animals that had worked their way into the house. These intuitive promptings seemed designed to alert family members to potential problems before they developed into full-blown crises. Animals within the household sometimes served as intermediaries through which the Domovoi communicated his concerns or warnings. Dogs and cats appeared to respond to the presence or activity of the spirit in ways that family members learned to interpret as signs. A dog might begin barking suddenly and persistently at nothing visible to human eyes, its attention directed toward a specific location in the house that upon investigation revealed some problem requiring correction. Horses became notably nervous or agitated when danger approached the household, their animal sensitivity to supernatural presence manifesting as behavior that served as advance warning to human inhabitants. Some accounts describe family pets responding to the Domovoi's presence with remarkable calm or apparent recognition, as if the animals perceived the spirit as a known entity and could sense his intentions and emotional state. The Domovoi seemed to understand that family members trusted their animals' instincts and used these intermediaries to amplify his warnings when direct communication seemed insufficient. The interpretation of these various manifestations required careful attention and cultural knowledge passed down through generations of Russian families. Not every unexplained sound or peculiar occurrence represented a genuine warning from the Domovoi, distinguishing authentic communication from mere coincidence, or the ordinary creaks and settling of an old structure required experience and attentiveness. Families developed intuitive expertise in reading the subtle qualities that differentiated the Domovoi's intentional communication from random phenomena. The tone of a knock, the location of a sound, the pattern of disturbances, and the emotional quality that seemed to accompany the manifestation all contributed to the interpretation. Over time, family members became attuned to their specific Domovoi's communication patterns, learning to recognize his characteristic ways of expressing concern or drawing attention to matters requiring investigation. What emerges from this examination of the Domovoi's communication methods is a picture of a supernatural being deeply committed to maintaining household welfare through active, ongoing engagement with the family members who share his dwelling. He was not a distant spirit, observing from some remote supernatural realm, but rather an intimate participant in the household's daily life, constantly monitoring conditions and proactively seeking to alert family members to dangers and problems. His communications might be oblique and requiring interpretation, but their fundamental purpose was clear: to ensure that the family members inhabiting the dwelling remained aware of threats and could take corrective action before minor problems developed into disasters. The Domovoi's commitment to household welfare manifested not only in his direct interventions, but also in his patient, persistent efforts to communicate, to warn, and to guide the family toward actions that would preserve their safety and prosperity. Among all the relationships the Domovoi maintained within the household economy, perhaps none was more significant or more carefully observed than his connection to the animals that sustained the family's survival. The livestock occupying the barn or pastures adjacent to the dwelling existed in a liminal position between human civilization and the wild world beyond. And the Domovoi's care for these creatures revealed something essential about his and his understanding of household welfare. Horses, cattle, chickens, and pigs were not viewed merely as property or economic resources in the traditional Russian household, but rather as semi-dependents whose welfare was inseparable from the family's own survival and prosperity. The Domovoi understood this relationship with perfect clarity, and his stewardship of the animals under his charge demonstrated a level of commitment and competence that frequently exceeded what human caretakers could achieve through their ordinary efforts. The horse occupied a particularly exalted position in the Domovoi's affections and in Russian culture more broadly, representing strength, independence, and connection to the wild territories beyond human settlement. Russian folklore consistently emphasized the special bond between the Domovoi and horses, describing a relationship that transcended ordinary animal husbandry into something approaching genuine attachment. Accounts from rural Russia describe the Domovoi spending hours in the barn with the family's horses, grooming them with supernatural care, his small, hairy hands working through their coats with meticulous attention that no human groom could match. Horses belonging to households where the Domovoi was revered and well treated developed coats of remarkable luster and health, their manes and tails seemingly groomed to perfection, even when the human family members could devote only minimal time to such tasks. The animals appeared to recognize the Domovoi's presence, responding to his touch with calmness and affection, rather than the fear one might expect from animals encountering a supernatural being. One of the most remarkable phenomena attributed to the Domovoi's relationship with horses involved a practice known as plaiting the mane, a phenomenon described in accounts from across Russia with such consistency that it demands serious consideration. Family members would awaken to discover that their horses' manes had been braided or woven into intricate patterns during the night. The work so precise and elaborate that it could only be attributed to deliberate action by an intelligent being. These braided manes were understood as marks of the Domovoi's favor, signs that he had spent time with the animal and had confirmed its health and worthiness. More practically, the braiding seemed to protect the horse's mane from tangling and damage, keeping the animal's coat in optimal condition through supernatural maintenance. Some accounts suggest that horses with regularly braided manes became faster, stronger, and more resistant to injury, as if the Domovoi's nocturnal grooming activities provided benefits that transcended mere aesthetic improvement. Beyond grooming and maintenance, the Domovoi's relationship with horses extended into protection from illness and injury. Accounts describe instances where horses belonging to respected families inexplicably recovered from illnesses that should have proven fatal. Their condition beginning to improve immediately after the Domovoi seemed to take particular interest in their welfare. A horse that had suffered a lameness that threatened to end its usefulness might find itself suddenly healed, able to walk and work without the debilitating pain that had seemed permanent. The Domovoi's intervention in such cases was understood as extending beyond supernatural healing into the realm of supernatural veterinary expertise, suggesting that this being possessed knowledge of animal care that transcended ordinary human understanding. Families reported that their horses seemed to age more slowly when under the Domovoi's care, retaining vigor and capability far longer than animals belonging to households where the spirit was neglected or disrespected. Cattle received similarly devoted attention from the Domovoi, though the of his relationship with these animals differed in subtle ways from his connection to horses. Where horses seemed to engage the Domovoi's affection and pride, cattle appeared to activate his sense of responsibility and protective care. Cows that might have become ill, barren, or unable to produce adequate milk would sometimes recover under the Domovoi's watchful stewardship, their fertility restored and their milk production increasing to remarkable levels. Accounts describe situations where a family facing potential economic disaster through the loss of a productive cow found the animal mysteriously recovering just as the family was preparing to slaughter it for meat. The Domovoi seemed to recognize that cattle represented the household's capital, their productivity essential to family survival, and he maintained their welfare with the dedication of a supernatural accountant protecting valuable resources. The connection between the family's prosperity and the health of their livestock became tangible through the Domovoi's devoted attention to the animal's well-being. Smaller, domestic animals, chickens, geese, pigs, also received the Domovoi's attention, though typically with less intensity than he devoted to horses and cattle. Yet even these humble creatures seemed to benefit from his presence and care, laying more eggs, growing larger and healthier, and maintaining better resistance to the diseases that commonly afflicted barnyard fowl. Some accounts describe the Domovoi developing particular fondness for specific animals, seemingly choosing favorites among the household's livestock and lavishing extraordinary attention upon them. A particular goose might receive such careful treatment that it grew to unusual size and vitality, clearly marked by the Domovoi's preference. Such favored animals seemed to sense the special attention, responding to the Domovoi's presence with remarkable calmness and what could only be described as affection. The Domovoi's relationship with animals revealed a particular sensitivity to suffering and a commitment to preventing unnecessary pain. Accounts describe situations where the Domovoi would intervene to prevent cruel treatment of animals, actually punishing family members who behaved with excessive harshness toward livestock. A person who beat a horse cruelly might find themselves suffering mysterious accidents or illnesses, the Domovoi's punishment clearly linked to the cruelty they had inflicted. This aspect of his character demonstrates that his protective mandate extended not merely to the household's interests, but to the welfare of all creatures under the household's care. The Domovoi appeared to understand that a family's moral character could be measured by their treatment of animals subject to their power, and he did not hesitate to enforce standards of decency toward the creatures dependent upon human stewardship. Some of the most intriguing folklore surrounding the Domovoi involves his apparent ability to communicate with and direct the household's animals. Accounts describe situations where animals seem to respond to the Domovoi's direction in ways that benefited the household. Horses leading the family to safety through dangerous terrain, cattle moving to water sources that the human herders had not yet discovered, and birds warning of approaching danger through behaviors that seemed coordinated rather than instinctive. This suggests that the Domovoi maintained a form of communication with the animals under his care, a supernatural language through which he could convey information and direct their behavior toward ends that served the household's welfare. Whether literal communication or a more subtle form of supernatural influence, the result was clear. Animals under the Domovoi's guidance seemed to operate with an intelligence and purpose that transcended ordinary animal behavior. To conceive of the Domovoi solely as a protector and beneficent guardian would be to misunderstand fundamentally the true of this being, and to ignore the countless accounts of his devastating anger and the terrible consequences that befell households that incurred his displeasure. The protective tenderness he showed toward respected families and carefully maintained homes concealed a capacity for rage so profound and so precisely directed that it transformed him from an invisible guardian into a force of household destruction. This duality, the simultaneous capacity for protection and punishment, for blessing and curse, represents the core of the Domovoi's character and explains why Russian families treated him with a respect that bordered on fear. He was not a being to be bargained with, appeased through ritual, or manipulated through prayer, but rather a spirit whose fundamental involved holding household members accountable to standards of conduct and household management that he would enforce with supernatural severity when violated. The conditions that triggered the Domovoi's wrath were not mysterious or arbitrary, but rather clearly defined through centuries of cultural transmission and accumulated experience. Laziness activated his anger with particular intensity, for he was a being fundamentally committed to the principle that all household members must contribute their labor to the family's survival and prosperity. A person who spent excessive time idle while others worked, who avoided their share of household duties, or who consistently failed to maintain their assigned responsibilities, could expect to experience the Domovoi's displeasure in increasingly severe manifestations. The spirit seemed to understand that laziness represented a form of betrayal, a failure to honor the implicit compact by which family members lived within the Domovoi's domain and accepted his protection. Those who worked diligently, who accepted their burdens without complaint, and who contributed consistently to household maintenance, remained beneath the threshold of his anger no matter how many other failures might characterize their conduct. Disrespect toward the Domovoi himself, or toward the household as his sacred domain, activated his wrath with even greater intensity than laziness. Speaking dismissively of the spirit, mocking the traditions and prohibitions associated with him, or treating the home with casual indifference rather than reverent care, all represented challenges to his authority and violations of the implicit respect that the household owed him in exchange for his protection. A family member who openly derided the belief in the Domovoi, who spoke contemptuous words about household spirits, or who suggested that such traditions were foolish superstition, could expect supernatural consequences of a severity that depended upon the degree of disrespect expressed. The Domovoi appeared to recognize that his authority rested not upon physical force or mystical dominance, but upon the voluntary respect and acknowledgement of the household members who inhabited his domain. Any diminishment of that respect represented a threat to the entire relationship that defined his connection to the home. Negligence in household maintenance, particularly regarding the sacred spaces where the Domovoi maintained his primary residences, could provoke his anger into full manifestation. The area behind the stove required constant attention. The accumulation of ash and detritus had to be cleared regularly, the space maintained in a state of reasonable cleanliness, and the stove itself cared for with diligence and respect. A family that allowed the stove area to become filthy or that neglected its maintenance demonstrated a fundamental carelessness about the household that the Domovoi would not tolerate. Similarly, the basement where he maintained his secondary residence demanded regular attention. Provisions had to be properly stored and maintained, spoilage prevented through careful oversight, and pests controlled through vigilance. A family that allowed the basement to become a dumping ground for rubbish, that neglected the organization of stored goods, or that permitted vermin to proliferate, invited the Domovoi's anger through their negligence. Disharmony and conflict within the family created conditions that particularly disturbed the Domovoi and could provoke his intervention in devastating ways. He was fundamentally committed to household unity and the proper ordering of family relationships, and he appeared to view conflict and discord as threats to the stability of the household he had sworn to protect. A household torn by constant quarreling, characterized by cruelty of family members toward one another, or lacking respect for the authority structure that the Domovoi understood as essential to household functioning would experience his punitive interventions. Yet, his anger in such situations seemed to focus specifically upon the perpetrators of conflict or cruelty rather than the innocent victims, suggesting that his wrath served a function of moral enforcement, attempting to correct behavior that violated his understanding of proper household conduct. The violation of the sacred prohibitions that governed household conduct could also provoke the Domovoi's anger, though the severity of his response seemed to depend upon the degree of disrespect implicit in the violation. Whistling in the house, for instance, represented not merely a breaking of an arbitrary rule, but a form of disrespect toward the Domovoi's authority and an implicit rejection of the cultural traditions that had governed the household for generations. One who whistled in defiance, as if mocking the prohibition, could expect far more severe consequences than one who whistled thoughtlessly, unaware of the cultural significance of the act. Similarly, sweeping at night or engaging in other behaviors associated with the prohibition list could activate his displeasure, though again, the intentionality behind the violation seemed to influence the severity of his response. Perhaps most disturbing to the Domovoi was the introduction of disrespect toward the household itself, through actions that suggested the family no longer valued their dwelling, or the stability that the Domovoi had worked to maintain. A family that considered abandoning the house, that contemplated moving to another residence without proper rituals of farewell and acknowledgement of the Domovoi's service, could expect his anger to manifest before such a move could occur. The spirit seemed to view the house as his responsibility and his charge, and the casual abandonment of that charge represented a rejection of everything he had invested in the household's welfare and stability. His anger in such situations could take the form of making the home uninhabitable, of creating conditions that forced the family to remain, or that made their departure inevitable through circumstances beyond their control. What distinguished the Domovoi's anger from the arbitrary cruelty of a demon, or the vindictive rage of a vengeful ghost, was its fundamental relationship to justice and household standards. His punishments seemed carefully calibrated to the offense committed, designed to correct behavior and enforce compliance, rather than to cause indiscriminate suffering. A person who committed a relatively minor violation might experience only mysterious discomforts or strange inconveniences, while one who engaged in serious violations of household standards could expect punishments of genuine severity. This suggests that the Domovoi possessed not merely the capacity for anger, but also a sophisticated moral framework through which he evaluated conduct and determined appropriate responses. He was not a supernatural tyrant inflicting random cruelty, but rather a judge operating according to principles that the household understood, even if those principles were not explicitly articulated. When the Domovoi's anger reaches its full manifestation, the household that has incurred his displeasure transforms into a space where chaos reigns and where nothing can be relied upon to remain stable or predictable. The protection that characterized his normal stewardship reverses into active hostility, and the very mechanisms through which he had safeguarded the family now become instruments of their torment. Objects that had seemed secure in their locations vanish without explanation, appearing days or weeks later in impossible places that suggest deliberate placement rather than accident. A family might discover their most essential tools and possessions scattered throughout the house, arranged in patterns that suggest intentional arrangement by an intelligence bent upon creating maximum disruption and confusion. The systematic of this destruction distinguishes it from mere chaotic poltergeist activity, revealing instead the calculated campaign of a being who understands exactly which items matter most and how their disappearance will create maximum distress. The phenomenon of objects inexplicably breaking assumes nightmarish proportions under the Domovoi's punitive attention, extending far beyond the normal fragility that characterizes household items. Dishes that had been unbroken for years would suddenly shatter for no apparent reason, sometimes when no one was near them, sometimes in response to events that should not have caused breakage. Wooden implements would crack or splinter spontaneously, their structural integrity somehow compromised by forces that left no visible evidence of trauma. Glass items would develop sudden fractures that seemed to originate from internal stress rather than external impact, a phenomenon that defied ordinary physical explanation. More disturbing still were instances where these breakages would cluster in time, multiple items breaking in succession over the course of hours or days, creating an impression of escalating destruction rather than random mishaps. A family experiencing such phenomena understood that their household was literally coming apart at invisible seams, that the integrity they had taken for granted was being systematically undermined by a supernatural force intent upon their distress. Tools essential to household survival and economic productivity became particular targets of the Domovoi's destructive attention when his anger reached full manifestation. Axes became mysteriously dull and difficult to sharpen, their blades remaining intractable despite the most careful honing. Agricultural implements would disappear for weeks, only to reappear in locations so absurd that their recovery became as maddening as their loss. Sewing needles would vanish entirely from households, forcing family members into frustration as they searched for replacements and struggled to acquire new tools. The impact of such disappearances extended beyond mere inconvenience into the realm of genuine survival anxiety. For in a traditional Russian household, the lack of essential tools threatened the family's capacity to produce food, maintain clothing, and perform the labor upon which their survival depended. The Domovoi's targeting of these implements suggested that he understood precisely how to strike at the household's economic foundation, creating stress that radiated through every family member's awareness of their vulnerability. The movement of household items assumed patterns so deliberate and so clearly purposeful that they could not be explained through ordinary physical mechanisms. Kitchen implements would rearrange themselves during the night, appearing in different locations when family members awakened to begin their daily work. Furniture would shift position inexplicably, sometimes by small amounts that family members might dismiss as their own forgetfulness, other times by distances so significant that they demanded acknowledgement of supernatural causation. Most disturbing were instances where items would be carefully arranged into patterns or messages, objects positioned in ways that suggested intentional communication from an intelligence expressing its anger through physical arrangement. Some accounts describe families discovering their household possessions arranged into chaotic scenes, pots and pans stacked in impossible towers, Tools arranged in crossing patterns, clothing scattered across rooms in apparent fury. The psychological impact of such discoveries transcended the mere inconvenience of disorder, striking at family members' fundamental sense of security within their own home. The deliberate creation of household disorder appeared to serve a psychological function beyond simple destruction, operating as a form of punishment through the generation of anxiety and a sense of violated sanctuary. A family could never be certain what condition they may would find their home in upon returning from work or upon awakening in the morning, never confident that carefully organized spaces would remain undisturbed. The Domovoi's disruption of household order attacked the very concept of home as a stable, organized refuge from the chaos of the outside world. By making the interior of the house unpredictable and threatening, he transformed the dwelling from a source of security into a source of constant dread. Family members would begin to fear entering certain rooms, uncertain what destruction or disorder awaited them. The psychological terror of this unpredictability often exceeded the direct material harm caused by the destruction itself, as the human mind struggled to maintain equilibrium in an environment where fundamental assumptions about stability and order no longer held true. Accounts describe instances where the Domovoi's destructive activity took on characteristics of calculated psychological warfare, targeting not merely objects, but the family members' emotional stability. He would focus his destructive attention on items of particular sentimental value, heirlooms passed down through generations, gifts from loved ones, possessions that carried emotional weight beyond their practical utility. A family might survive the loss of a purely functional tool, but the destruction of an object laden with sentimental meaning struck a different psychological blow, suggesting that the Domovoi's anger extended to personal relationships and family bonds themselves. Some accounts describe situations where the spirit would destroy an item crucial to an individual family member's work or identity, a targeted destruction that seemed designed to hurt that specific person. A seamstress might find all her needles vanished. A craftsman's specialized tools would disappear. A child's beloved possession would be broken. Such targeted destructions suggested intelligence and malevolence working in concert. A supernatural being not merely causing chaos, but deliberately orchestrating suffering. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the Domovoi's destructive manifestations involved the creation of an environment where family members could not establish causation or predictability. Items would break without any apparent triggering event. Tools would vanish without explanation. Household order would descend into chaos without visible agency. This lack of discernible cause created cognitive dissonance that pushed family members toward the edge of psychological stability, as they struggled to maintain rational frameworks for understanding events that seemed to violate physical law. The mind seeks patterns and causation. When presented with phenomena that resist such categorization, the human consciousness experiences profound distress. Family members would begin to question their own memories and perceptions, wondering if they had truly placed an item somewhere or if their memory was unreliable. The Domovoi's chaos was not random violence, but rather a calculated assault upon human psychological coherence itself. Accounts from rural Russia describe situations where families living under the weight of the Domovoi's full punitive manifestation experienced conditions approaching total household collapse. Meals could not be reliably prepared. Clothing could not be maintained. Basic household organization became impossible under the constant interference and destruction. Some families reported that the situation escalated to the point where they felt compelled to abandon their home, the psychological and practical burden of living under such conditions exceeding their capacity to endure. Yet others reported that the situation eventually resolved, either through the family's implementation of corrective actions, increased diligence, more respectful conduct, renewed attention to household maintenance, or through the passage of time, as if the Domovoi's anger eventually exhausted itself. These accounts suggest that the spirit's punitive manifestations, while devastating in their immediate impact, were not eternal or immutable, but rather responses to specific violations that could theoretically be corrected through subsequent compliance with household standards. The Domovoi's relationship with children occupied a paradoxical space within Russian folklore, encompassing both protective care and the capacity for psychological punishment that seems specifically calibrated to inflict fear and distress upon the young and vulnerable. While accounts describe his tenderness toward children living in households where he was respected and the family maintained proper standards, these same traditions contain deeply unsettling descriptions of his treatment of children in households where his anger had been provoked or where negligent parenting suggested insufficient respect for his authority. Children, in the Domovoi's understanding, represented the future of the household and the continuation of the family line that would inhabit his dwelling for generations to come. When children were properly educated to respect household standards and to acknowledge the spirit's presence and authority, he seemed to regard them with something approaching affection. Yet when children were permitted to grow wild and disrespectful, or when parental negligence suggested insufficient investment in their proper development, the Domovoi appeared to take it upon himself to provide the discipline that the parents had failed to administer. Among the most widely reported phenomena attributed to the Domovoi's interaction with children were sudden and apparently causeless frights that would seize young people without warning. A child might be playing quietly in the house when something would startle them into sudden, overwhelming terror, not the mild surprise of a normal scare, but rather a visceral fear response of such intensity that the child would scream and cry, unable to articulate what had frightened them. Parents attempting to discover the source of the fear would find no obvious threat or stimulus, no hidden animal or dangerous object that could explain the child's terror. Yet the child's fear response remained genuine and physiologically real. Racing heartbeat, trembling, genuine distress, suggesting that something had indeed frightened them, even if invisible to parental eyes. Repeated instances of such unexplained frights would accumulate, creating in the child a persistent sense of unease within their own home, a feeling that the familiar space of the house contained invisible threats that might emerge without warning. These supernatural frights seemed to follow patterns that suggested intentionality rather than randomness, often occurring at moments when a child was engaged in behavior that violated household standards or parental instruction. A child who had been explicitly forbidden from going into a particular room might experience an overwhelming sense of presence or dread if they attempted to enter despite the prohibition, a fear response so immediate and intense that they would flee the space in terror. Another child, who had been told not to touch certain objects, might feel sudden, inexplicable panic when reaching for a forbidden item, the fear response functioning as a supernatural enforcement of parental authority. The Domovoi appeared to be reinforcing household rules and parental instruction through the induction of fear responses that made violation of these standards psychologically untenable. In such cases, the spirit was not merely punishing disobedience, but rather taking an active role in child rearing, implementing discipline that supported and reinforced parental authority. More severe forms of the Domovoi's interaction with children took the form of actual physical phenomena that children experienced in the darkness of their sleeping spaces. Accounts describe children reporting sensations of being touched by invisible presences during the night, hands grasping their bedclothes, invisible fingers brushing their skin, or a sense of presence hovering near their sleeping form. These physical encounters occurred within the context of complete darkness, and often while family members were present but not directly supervising the child, creating a situation where the child could not be entirely certain whether what they experienced was real or merely imagined in the disorientation of sleep. The psychological impact of such experiences transcended any actual physical contact, as the child was forced to contemplate the possibility that invisible beings inhabited their bedroom and could approach them while they were vulnerable and defenseless. The Domovoi's apparent willingness to create such intimate contact with sleeping children suggested a being willing to penetrate the most private and psychologically vulnerable moments of childhood existence. Unexplained illnesses and physical ailments appeared in some accounts to be connected to the Domovoi's displeasure with particular children, or with the household's overall conduct and respect. Children who were persistently ill, suffering from fevers, digestive disturbances, lethargy, or other conditions that resisted explanation through ordinary medical understanding, were sometimes believed to be experiencing the Domovoi's punishment. These illnesses would often improve dramatically once the family modified their behavior, increased their respect for household standards, or implemented specific rituals of appeasement toward the spirit. The mechanism through which a supernatural being could influence the physical health of a child remained mysterious. Yet families reported such correlations frequently enough that the possibility of the Domovoi's involvement in childhood illness became a standard part of the cultural framework through which parents understood their children's health. A child's illness might prompt family members to examine their own conduct and household practices, leading them to identify violations of Domovoi-related standards that might explain the child's malady. Nightmares and night terrors represented another avenue through which the Domovoi could inflict psychological torment upon children, creating sleep disturbances that left the young exhausted and psychologically distressed. Children would awaken in the night in states of extreme fear, screaming for their parents, unable to articulate what had terrified them so profoundly, but clearly traumatized by whatever had occurred during their sleep. These were not the normal bad dreams that all children experience, but rather episodes of such intensity and psychological impact that they seemed to mark the child for extended periods afterward. A child subjected to repeated night terrors would become afraid of sleep itself, developing a kind of sleep anxiety that interfered with their normal development and well-being. Parents would sometimes discover that implementing changes to household conduct or increasing their respectful acknowledgement of the Domovoi resulted in an immediate cessation of the child's night terrors, a correlation suggesting that the spirit had been deliberately using these sleep disturbances as a mechanism of punishment or enforcement. The sophistication of the Domovoi's psychological approach to child punishment suggested that he understood the developing human mind and knew precisely which forms of fear and distress would be most effective in altering behavior. Unlike a mindless supernatural force that might inflict random suffering, the Domovoi seemed to tailor his interventions to achieve specific behavioral outcomes. A child who was too bold and defiant might experience humiliation or public embarrassment. A child prone to laziness might suffer sudden bouts of overwhelming fatigue and sluggishness. A child who was disrespectful might find themselves mysteriously unable to speak for periods, forcing them into silence that prevented them from perpetuating their disrespect. These targeted interventions suggest that the Domovoi possessed not merely the capacity to inflict suffering, but the intelligence and restraint to calibrate his interventions to achieve educational outcomes rather than mere destruction. Particularly significant are accounts suggesting that the Domovoi's harsh treatment of children served a function within the broader cultural framework of Russian childhood development and education. In a society where parental authority was paramount and where the maintenance of household order depended upon children accepting and internalizing strict behavioral standards, the Domovoi functioned as a reinforcement mechanism, a supernatural being whose interventions supplemented and supported parental discipline. Children learned through experience that violations of household standards would result not merely in parental punishment, but in mysterious, supernatural consequences. This knowledge instilled respect for the household itself as a sacred space governed by laws that transcended ordinary human authority. The Domovoi's willingness to punish children suggested that he regarded their proper education and discipline as part of his responsibility to maintain the household's integrity across generations. Among the most terrifying and physiologically immediate manifestations of the Domovoi's displeasure stands a phenomenon that bridges the boundary between the supernatural and the explicable, existing in that liminal space where cultural belief and subjective physical experience converge in ways that defy simple categorization. The experience known colloquially as being pressed, a sensation of crushing weight descending upon the sleeper's chest, the inability to move or cry out, and the terrifying conviction that something is slowly suffocating them, represents perhaps the most intimate and psychologically devastating of all the Domovoi's punitive interventions. This is not a mere nightmare or anxiety dream, but rather an experience so physically real and so powerfully disorienting that those who have endured it carry the trauma for the remainder of their lives. The sensation of an invisible hand closing around the throat, the desperate struggle for breath against an implacable pressure, the absolute certainty that death approaches, these constitute a form of psychological torture so effective that families recognize the phenomenon immediately as an intervention by the household spirit when no other explanation could account for the experience. Accounts describing these nocturnal attacks demonstrate consistent patterns across diverse regions of Russia and across centuries of recorded folklore, suggesting a phenomenon rooted in genuine experience, rather than mere cultural transmission of imaginary events. A person would awaken in the night, or sometimes begin to experience the sensation while transitioning between wakefulness and sleep, becoming aware of an overwhelming sense of pressure accumulating upon their chest and torso. This was not the gentle weight of heavy blankets or the discomfort of an awkward sleeping position, but rather a crushing pressure that seemed to emanate from an invisible source and that increased in intensity with each moment of the victim's awareness. The paralysis that accompanied this pressure prevented the victim from moving, from fleeing the bed, or from calling out to family members for assistance. They were locked into immobility while experiencing the terrifying sensation of being slowly strangled by something they could neither see nor physically resist. The mechanism through which the victim perceived this strangulation varied in its specific manifestations, yet the fundamental experience remained consistent across different accounts. Some victims reported feeling invisible hands wrapped around their throat, a sensation of fingers tightening with inexorable pressure that gradually constricted their airway. Others described a more diffuse pressure emanating from the air itself, a compressive force that squeezed their chest and made breathing progressively more difficult. The distinction between these variations mattered less than the universal experience of breathlessness, of the lungs' desperate need for air becoming increasingly urgent as the pressure continued. Some accounts describe victims actually losing consciousness as the pressure became total, awakening later to find themselves gasping for air and uncertain whether they had genuinely experienced strangulation or whether the event had occurred in the dream state where normal physical laws do not operate. The duration of these episodes created uncertainty about their actual occurrence, a psychological ambiguity that intensified the terror experienced by those subjected to them. The events seemed to last for subjective eternities. Victims described the sensation of seconds stretching into hours as they struggled against the invisible pressure. Yet, upon awakening or partially recovering consciousness, they would discover that only minutes had passed, or sometimes only seconds, the temporal distortion itself suggesting that the experience existed partially outside normal time. This temporal anomaly added an additional layer of unsettling uncertainty. Had the strangulation actually occurred in the way they remembered, or had some portion of it existed only in the dream state, while the remaining portion was genuine physical experience? The inability to establish clear boundaries between dream and waking reality compounded the psychological impact of the attacks, leaving victims uncertain about the ontological status of their own experience. The phenomenon of the Domovoi's strangulation attacks connects deeply to broader European traditions of nocturnal supernatural assault, suggesting that similar experiences across diverse cultures might reflect genuine encounters with the same category of supernatural phenomena. The incubus and succubus of Western European folklore, the demon lovers of Mediterranean traditions, and various night visitor entities described across the continent all shared certain characteristics with the Domovoi's strangulation attacks. They occurred during sleep or the transitional state between sleep and waking. They involved sensations of pressure or weight upon the victim. They produced physical symptoms that persisted after waking. And they targeted individuals who seemed to have violated some understood standard of household or personal conduct. The universality of these experiences across cultures, geographically distant from one another and lacking documented communication, suggests either that human physiology produces similar hallucinations under comparable psychological stress, or that supernatural beings across diverse cultures employ similar tactics in their interaction with humans. The victims of these strangulation attacks typically discovered through painful experience that the phenomenon bore direct relationship to their conduct within the household and their respect for household standards. A person who had been persistently lazy, disrespectful, or negligent in their household duties might experience such an attack as a direct consequence of their misconduct. The Domovoi appeared to deploy this particular punishment not randomly, but rather as a final warning, a last resort when less severe interventions had failed to correct behavior that threatened household integrity. Accounts describe situations where individuals subjected to strangulation. Attacks would modify their conduct immediately upon recovering from the experience. The visceral terror of the attack serving as motivation for behavioral change, more effective than any rational persuasion could achieve. The psychological impact of nearly being strangled in one's sleep created a powerful incentive to reconsider one's conduct and to implement whatever behavioral modifications were necessary to avoid repetition of the experience. Women appeared in accounts to suffer these strangulation attacks with particular frequency, though the reason for this gender distribution remains ambiguous. Some accounts suggest that the Domovoi targeted women who failed in their household duties or who neglected the maintenance of domestic order, areas of responsibility traditionally assigned to women within the family structure. Other accounts imply that women in general might have been more vulnerable to supernatural attack, their psychological responsiveness making them more susceptible to both the Domovoi's influence and to the physiological phenomena associated with the sensation of strangulation. The gender of these attacks raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between cultural oppression, the enforcement of gender-based behavioral standards, and the supernatural manifestations that seem to reinforce those standards through fear and violence. The physical aftermath of strangulation attacks provided evidence suggesting that at least some aspect of the experience transcended mere psychological hallucination. Victims frequently reported visible marks upon their necks and chests after recovering from attacks, bruises, red marks, or other physical evidence that appeared inconsistent with what one would expect from a purely psychological phenomenon, while skeptics might explain such marks through the victim's own actions during the attack. Fingernails scratching their own skin, pressure from their own body against the bedding. The consistency of such physical evidence across different accounts and different individuals suggested something more complex occurring. The Domovoi appeared capable of leaving physical traces of his assault, evidence that persisted into the waking world and that confronted victims with the terrifying possibility that what they had experienced possessed genuine physical reality rather than existing only in the dream state. Accounts describe families implementing specific interventions when a household member had experienced strangulation attacks, behavioral modifications designed to appease the Domovoi and prevent recurrence of the phenomenon, increased diligence in household maintenance, more respectful conduct, explicit verbal apologies to the spirit, and offerings of food or other gifts all appeared in accounts as measures taken to prevent further attacks. The effectiveness of such interventions, at least according to the testimonies that have survived, suggested that the phenomenon bore genuine relationship to the household's conduct and the Domovoi's assessment of family members' respect and commitment to household standards. The strangulation attacks represented not random supernatural malevolence, but rather a calculated enforcement mechanism, a terror-based intervention designed to compel behavioral change in household members who had persistently violated standards that the Domovoi understood as essential to household integrity. The relationship between the Domovoi and the family inhabiting his domain rests not upon explicit written codes or formal agreements articulated in legal language, but rather upon a complex system of prohibitions, taboos, and behavioral expectations, transmitted through generations by cultural osmosis and implicit understanding. These rules exist in the space between the conscious and the intuitive, known to every Russian family, yet rarely articulated explicitly, forming an invisible architecture of constraint within which household members learn to navigate their daily existence. To violate these prohibitions was not merely to engage in some arbitrary transgression, but rather to strike at the fundamental foundations upon which the entire relationship between household and spirit rested. The Domovoi enforced these laws not through written threat or explicit warning, but through the subtle escalation of supernatural consequences that would eventually convince even the most skeptical family member that certain behaviors simply could not be tolerated within the sacred space of the home. Among the most universally recognized and consistently prohibited behaviors was whistling within the interior spaces of the home, a prohibition so widespread and so strictly enforced that it appeared almost across all recorded Russian folklore regarding household conduct. The reason for this prohibition operated at multiple levels simultaneously. Whistling was understood to attract supernatural attention or to summon spirits other than the Domovoi, potentially introducing malevolent entities into the household. It represented a form of frivolous behavior, suggesting insufficient seriousness about household matters, and it was understood to be actively displeasing to the Domovoi himself, an offense to his sensibilities and his authority. The prohibition against whistling suggested that the Domovoi maintained particular sensory preferences and aesthetic standards, that he possessed specific responses to particular sounds and behaviors. A family member who whistled inside the house, particularly if they did so with apparent defiance or mockery of the prohibition, could expect swift and unmistakable consequences. Strange accidents, the sudden disappearance of personal items, or more direct interventions designed to communicate the spirit's displeasure with the violation. Sweeping the floor during nighttime hours represented another widely recognized prohibition that appeared with such consistency across Russian regions that it seemed to represent a fundamental principle governing household conduct. The the reasoning behind this prohibition involved multiple layers. Sweeping at night was understood to sweep away the household's luck and abundance. It disturbed the spaces where the Domovoi maintained his domains and moved through the house. And it suggested a slovenly household that required cleaning at inappropriate times, rather than maintaining constant order. The sweep itself, the broom pushing accumulated debris and dust across floors in darkness, appeared to be understood as a form of aggression against the spiritual order that the Domovoi had established. Families that required floor cleaning might do so during daylight hours, but night cleaning was strictly avoided. The consequences of violating this prohibition included the sudden illness of family members, the acceleration of spoilage in stored provisions, or more direct supernatural harassment designed to punish the transgression. Disrespectful speech about the Domovoi himself, whether within his domain or beyond it, represented a violation so serious that even the most casual mockery could invite supernatural response. One did not speak of the household spirit with irony or derision, did not make jokes at his expense, and did not express skepticism about his existence or power within the confines of the home. To do so was to challenge his authority directly, to suggest through one's words and tone that his presence was insignificant, or that his capacity for response could be mocked with impunity. The consequences of such disrespect could be severe and immediate, the Domovoi responding to verbal challenge with physical manifestations of his displeasure. Stories circulated of individuals who had mocked the Domovoi within their household only to experience accidents, illnesses, or inexplicable deterioration of their circumstances within hours of the transgression. The prohibition against excessive noise or loud quarreling within the household represented the Domovoi's insistence upon maintaining the peaceful order necessary for his domain. Loud arguments that disturbed the household's serenity, the screaming of angry family members, or the chaos of physical violence all represented violations of the implicit compact governing household conduct. The Domovoi appeared to understand that conflict and discord created conditions incompatible with the stable, orderly household he sought to maintain. Families that descended into constant verbal warfare could expect his interventions to escalate, beginning with small disturbances designed to interrupt arguments and potentially escalating to more severe punishments if the conflict continued despite his warnings. The prohibition against excessive noise suggested that the Domovoi valued peace and order as not merely practical concerns, but as essential to his own well-being and comfort. The treatment of fire and the stove deserved particular attention within the system of household prohibitions, as this represented the most sacred of all household spaces and the one most intimately associated with the Domovoi's presence. One did not carelessly manipulate fire, did not allow the stove to burn inefficiently, did not neglect the ashes or permit the immediate surroundings to become filthy. Fire represented both survival and the potential for destruction, and the Domovoi's commitment to maintaining its proper function extended to the enforcement of strict standards regarding how family members approached this dangerous element. Spitting into fire, throwing trash into flames that should have been disposed of differently, or wasting fuel through careless burning could all invoke the spirit's anger. The intense heat of the stove and the fundamental role it played in the household's survival created a kind of sacred geography around it, a space where the Domovoi's authority reached its fullest expression. Forbidden also was the violation of the basement's sanctity through careless storage of provisions, or the introduction of waste and disorder into that sacred space. The basement represented the Domovoi's secondary domain, and he maintained strict standards regarding how family members used this space and how they treated the provisions stored there. One did not carelessly spoil food that the family had worked to produce and preserve. One did not introduce vermin through negligent storage practices. One did not permit the space to descend into disorder or filth. The Domovoi's relationship with this space extended to the point where families understood that disturbing the basement unnecessarily or with disrespectful intent could invoke his response. Stories circulated of individuals who had entered the basement with disrespectful demeanor only to experience inexplicable accidents or illnesses that seemed clearly linked to the transgression. Silent within the system of prohibitions lay the implicit requirement of gratitude and acknowledgement. That family members maintain a posture of appreciation for the Domovoi's protection and provision, rather than taking his services for granted or assuming that they naturally deserved his protection. To speak as if the household's prosperity resulted entirely from human effort, to fail to acknowledge the spirit's role in the family's survival, or to conduct oneself as if the Domovoi's protection was merely the expected natural order rather than a gift requiring gratitude, represented a subtle but significant violation. The Domovoi expected to be recognized as an active participant in the household's welfare, not merely a passive supernatural presence. Family members who maintained awareness of the spirit's role in their lives, who conducted themselves with the implicit understanding that their dwelling and their prosperity existed within his domain and under his protection, could maintain the positive relationship that secured his ongoing favor. Those who forgot this fundamental principle, who began to act as if they were saucer, as if that their household and their safety were simply the natural outcome of their own efforts, risked awakening the Domovoi's displeasure through this most subtle form of disrespect. The moment when a family crossed the threshold of a new dwelling for the first time represented one of the most spiritually significant moments in Russian domestic life. A transitional point pregnant with possibility and charged with the necessity of establishing a proper relationship with the supernatural inhabitant of that space. The new dwelling was not merely empty real estate awaiting human occupation, but rather a space already inhabited by the Domovoi, who had maintained it through whatever previous cycles of habitation it had experienced. To enter this space without proper ritual acknowledgement, without explicit welcome extended to the existing spiritual inhabitant, risked establishing the relationship on a foundation of disrespect and oversight that could poison the family's entire subsequent tenure in the home. Russian families understood with profound clarity that the first moments within a new dwelling determined the spiritual tenor of all that would follow, that the manner of arrival and the rituals performed during those initial moments would shape the Domovoi's perception of the new inhabitants and establish the fundamental tone of their supernatural relationship. The most essential of all welcoming rituals involved the presentation of bread to the Domovoi, a substance so fundamental to Russian sustenance and so symbolically rich that its offering transcended mere food provision into something approaching spiritual communion. Tradition dictated that the first item a family should bring into a newly occupied dwelling was not furniture or tools or precious possessions, but rather a loaf of bread, often accompanied by salt, elements of such primal significance that they represented the family's commitment to sharing their most basic sustenance with the household spirit. The bread was typically left in a prominent location within the home, often in the kitchen or near the stove, presented as an offering to the Domovoi and as a symbolic gesture indicating that the family recognized his presence and welcomed his continued habitation of the space. This offering carried multiple layers of meaning. It demonstrated the family's respect for the spirit. It promised that they would maintain the household in a state worthy of its spiritual inhabitant. And it invited the Domovoi's benevolent attention as the family began their life within his domain. The rituals surrounding milk offered similar significance to those surrounding bread, milk representing both nourishment and the connection to the domestic animals that constituted an essential part of the household's economy and survival. In some traditions, the family would leave milk in a specific location within the home, often in the basement or behind the stove, creating a libation for the Domovoi analogous to the offerings that human societies had made to their supernatural benefactors since time immemorial. The milk represented the family's acknowledgement of the Domovoi's role in the household's prosperity and their implicit promise to maintain the animals that produced this milk under appropriate standards of care. The combination of bread and milk, of grain product and animal product, encompassed the two primary categories of sustenance that the Domovoi would work to protect and preserve throughout the family's tenure. The offering of these items established the family's understanding that they inhabited the Domovoi's domain not as proprietors, but as guests, permitted to reside there through the spirit's sufferance and goodwill. The timing and sequencing of the welcoming rituals carried profound significance, with specific actions prescribed to occur in particular orders that suggested the transmission of deeply held cultural understandings about the proper way to establish household relationships. A family entering a new dwelling should proceed first to the stove area, the spiritual heart of the home, and establish their presence there before proceeding to other areas. The eldest member of the household, or sometimes the female head of household if she was younger or more respected, would typically conduct or lead the welcoming rituals, suggesting that these ceremonies represented an acceptance of responsibility for the household's spiritual well-being and a commitment to maintaining proper standards within it. Some traditions prescribed that the family should spend the first night in the new dwelling, a physical occupation that seemed to mark them as legitimate inhabitants rather than temporary visitors. The first night represented a kind of threshold passage through which the family transitioned from outsider status to accepted inhabitant status within the Domovoi's domain. The psychological and social dimensions of these welcoming rituals extended beyond their purely spiritual significance to encompass broader functions within the family's collective consciousness and within the community context within which the relocation occurred. The ritual of bread and milk offering served as a conscious acknowledgement moment, a time when family members collectively recognized that they were entering a new phase of life and that this transition carried weight and significance beyond the merely logistical. The performance of these rituals in the presence of family members created a shared experience of intentionality and purpose, bonding family members together through their collective engagement with a meaningful activity. Within the broader community, the family's performance of these rituals served as a public statement that they understood and respected traditional values, that they recognized the spiritual dimensions of household establishment, and that they took seriously the obligations inherent in occupying a dwelling within the shared cultural framework. Some traditions prescribed specific verbal acknowledgements or greetings to be directed toward the Domovoi as part of the welcoming rituals, though the exact formulas varied considerably across different regions and family traditions. A family might speak directly to the spirit, addressing him respectfully and introducing themselves as the new inhabitants of his dwelling, explaining their intention to maintain the home properly and to respect his authority and presence. These verbal formulations served multiple functions simultaneously. They demonstrated the family's awareness that the Domovoi was a being capable of understanding language and responding to communication. They established a tone of respectful engagement that would, ideally, characterize the entire subsequent relationship. And they publicly articulated the family's commitment to household standards and spiritual propriety. The act of speaking to an invisible being might seem bizarre or superstitious to the modern skeptical observer, yet within the cultural context of traditional Russia, it represented a rational and meaningful engagement with a recognized aspect of household reality. In some regions, welcoming rituals incorporated the symbolic destruction or transformation of previous markers of habitation, suggesting that the new family was establishing their own unique relationship with the dwelling, rather than merely continuing a relationship established by previous inhabitants. A family might deliberately rearrange furniture that had been left by previous occupants, rebuild the fire in the stove using wood gathered by family members themselves, or perform other small acts of transformation designed to mark the space as their own, while still maintaining respect for the Domovoi's ancient occupation. These acts of symbolic transformation seem to communicate to the spirit that while the new family respected his primacy within the dwelling, they would establish their own terms of habitation and would shape the household according to their own needs and standards. The balance between respect for the Domovoi's pre-existing authority and the family's assertion of their own presence within the space represented a delicate negotiation that welcoming rituals were designed to facilitate. The performance of welcoming rituals sometimes extended across multiple days or even weeks, particularly in cases where the family was uncertain about the previous inhabitant's relationship with the Domovoi, or when they anticipated potential difficulties in establishing harmonious cohabitation. Additional offerings might be made at specific times, prayers or invocations offered during moments of particular household vulnerability, or specific behaviors avoided during the initial period to avoid offending the spirit during this sensitive transition period. Some families hired elder women, known to possess particular expertise in dealing with household spirits, to conduct or supervise the welcoming rituals, recognizing that the specialized knowledge required to perform these ceremonies properly transcended ordinary household knowledge. The investment of time, resources, and attention devoted to these rituals reflected the profound seriousness with which Russian families regarded the establishment of proper relationship with the Domovoi, and their understanding that this initial foundation would determine the quality of all subsequent interaction. The maintenance of a harmonious and prosperous relationship with the Domovoi extended far beyond the one-time welcoming rituals that marked a family's initial entry into a dwelling, requiring instead a continuous purposeful engagement through regular offerings and practices designed to demonstrate ongoing respect and gratitude for the spirit's protection and provision. These were not mere superstitions or quaint folk customs, but rather the fundamental mechanisms through which families conducted a kind of spiritual housekeeping, maintaining the relationship with their supernatural guardian through deliberate acts of acknowledgement and material exchange. The regularity and consistency of these offerings appeared to be particularly important, suggesting that the Domovoi responded not merely to grand gestures of respect, but to the steady, reliable demonstration of commitment to household standards and spiritual propriety. A family that maintained these practices with consistency and sincerity could expect to receive in return the Domovoi's unwavering protection and his intervention on their behalf during moments of crisis or danger. The most ubiquitous of all offerings involved the provision of food to the Domovoi, a practice so widespread and so consistently documented that it clearly represented one of the central pillars of proper household conduct. Bread, already established as essential to the welcoming ritual, continued to occupy a place of particular significance in the ongoing relationship between family and spirit. In many households, a piece of bread was regularly left in a designated location, often behind the stove, sometimes in the basement, occasionally in a special corner reserved specifically for offerings to the spirit, where it would remain until it became stale or began to spoil, at which point it would be replaced with fresh bread. This continuous cycle of offering and replacement created a perpetual acknowledgement of the Domovoi's presence within the household, a daily ritual that family members performed with such regularity that it became almost automatic, yet never losing its essential meaning and spiritual significance. Milk represented the second essential component of regular offerings to the Domovoi, its provision following similar patterns to those established for bread, yet sometimes with different spatial arrangements and temporal schedules. Some families left milk in a bowl or cup in a specific location, allowing it to remain for a set period before disposing of it and providing fresh milk the following day. Others poured milk as a libation onto the ground near the stove or in the basement, creating a more transitory offering that disappeared naturally rather than accumulating in physical vessels. The milk, like the bread, represented the family's commitment to sharing their basic sustenance with the spirit, an act of generosity that acknowledged the Domovoi's role in the household's prosperity and the animal's productivity. The regularity with which families maintained these milk offerings suggested that the practice served functions beyond mere spiritual appeasement, possibly representing a kind of household accounting system through which families kept track of their obligations and their commitment to maintaining proper standards. Salted and sweet foods sometimes supplemented the basic offerings of bread and milk, particularly during holidays or moments when the family felt especially gratitude for the Domovoi's intervention in their affairs. Porridge, a staple of Russian diet, appeared frequently in accounts of offerings, suggesting that this humble food held particular significance in the relationship between household and spirit. Some families made special porridge specifically for the Domovoi, preparing it with particular care and leaving it as an offering in a sacred space within the house. The act of preparing food specifically intended for the spirit seemed to transform ordinary household cooking into a kind of sacred practice, elevating the mundane activity of food preparation into something approaching ritual significance. The care and attention devoted to preparing these offerings, the quality of ingredients used, and the respect maintained throughout the process appeared to communicate volumes about the family's spiritual commitment and their understanding of the Domovoi's importance within the household. Beyond food, certain non-consumable offerings appeared in various regional traditions surrounding the Domovoi, though these seem to be less universal than bread and milk offerings and more dependent upon specific family traditions or regional practices. Some accounts describe families leaving small gifts, a length of cloth, a simple wooden carving, a decorated object, in the Domovoi's domain as offerings expressing appreciation or requesting particular intervention. These objects seem to function as tokens or symbols of the family's devotion, physical manifestations of spiritual commitment that existed beyond the immediate utility of food offerings. The giving of gifts created a social relationship that transcended the purely transactional of food provision, introducing elements of genuine exchange and mutual regard that characterized relationships between equals or between beings with genuine affection for one another. The Domovoi's reception of these gifts, evidenced through his continued protection and the absence of punitive manifestations, seemed to affirm that he understood and valued these tokens of respect. The practice of speaking respectfully of the Domovoi, of acknowledging his presence and his role in household affairs, constituted another essential component of the reverence system through which families maintained proper relationship with the spirit. This was not elaborate prayer or formal religious invocation, but rather the integration of respectful acknowledgement into the normal flow of household conversation and family interaction. A family member might credit the Domovoi with preventing accidents, with ensuring good harvests, or with protecting livestock, speaking of the spirit as an active and effective presence, rather than as a distant abstraction. Children would learn through this constant verbal acknowledgement that the Domovoi was a recognized member of the household community, a being worthy of respect and gratitude alongside family members themselves. The linguistic habits through which families spoke about the Domovoi seemed to shape their children's understanding of household structure and supernatural reality, embedding respect for the spirit into their very conception of what a properly functioning household should be. The maintenance of cleanliness and order, while partially an expression of practical household management, also functioned as a form of continuous reverence toward the Domovoi and as a statement of respect for his domain. A well-organized household with floors swept regularly, tools arranged properly, and storage spaces maintained with care, communicated through its very structure that the family understood and accepted their responsibility for maintaining the quality of the space that the Domovoi had entrusted to their care. The act of cleaning the stove area, of removing accumulated ash and ensuring that this sacred space remained appropriate for the Domovoi's habitation, transformed an ordinary household chore into a form of spiritual practice and reverence. The basement, similarly maintained with care and organized thoughtfully, demonstrated the family's ongoing respect for the Domovoi's secondary domain and their commitment to stewardship of the household's material resources. Through these daily practices of maintenance and organization, families engaged in continuous reverence toward the spirit, their actions speaking louder than any verbal invocation could achieve. The teaching of these practices to children represented a crucial function of family life, ensuring that the culture of reverence toward the Domovoi would perpetuate across generations and that each new generation would grow up understanding the household's relationship to its supernatural inhabitant. Children learned through observation and instruction that certain behaviors were expected, certain standards maintained, and certain practices performed with consistency. Through the accumulation of these teachings and practices, the household established itself as a coherent moral and spiritual community, united by shared understanding of obligations and expectations. The children who grew up within this framework internalized the values and practices so thoroughly that they eventually transmitted them to their own families, ensuring the survival of Domovoi-related traditions, even through centuries of social change and modernization. To journey into the remote villages of rural Russia in the contemporary world is to discover that the Domovoi has not been relegated to the museum of forgotten folklore, preserved only in academic texts and antiquarian collections, but rather that he continues to inhabit the consciousness and the daily practices of people whose connection to the land and to traditional ways of life remains unbroken despite centuries of change and modernization. In regions where the grip of industrial civilization has loosened, where families still maintain small farms, and where the traditional rhythms of agricultural life continue to structure existence, the Domovoi persists, not as a historical curiosity, but as a living presence recognized by grandmothers and children alike. The continuation of these traditions into the contemporary world cannot be explained through mere cultural inertia or the stubborn resistance of rural people to change, but rather speaks to something more profound about the enduring human need to conceptualize and interact with the invisible forces that govern household welfare and domestic stability. The Domovoi survives because, despite all the transformations that modernity has wrought, the fundamental human experience of living in a home, of maintaining that home against entropy and neglect, and of experiencing phenomena that resist rational explanation continues to activate the psychological and cultural frameworks that the Domovoi represents. In villages where electricity remains unreliable and where winters still impose their ancient severity upon the landscape, families continue to perform variations of the welcoming rituals that their ancestors conducted centuries ago when moving into new dwellings. A grandmother preparing bread and milk to leave behind the stove for the Domovoi may live in a house with modern amenities. Yet she understands her practice not as nostalgic recreation, but as the perpetuation of necessary tradition. Her children, educated in Soviet schools and exposed to materialist ideology that explicitly rejected supernatural belief, find themselves in their own homes as adults, re-establishing the very traditions they were taught to dismiss as superstition. The transition occurs without dramatic conversion or explicit recommitment, but rather through the subtle accumulation of experiences that rational frameworks cannot adequately explain. The sudden recovery of a child from grave illness, the mysterious resolution of a family crisis, the inexplicable disappearance and reappearance of crucial objects at moments when their loss would have created disaster. These experiences, occurring within the private space of the family home, reactivate ancient patterns of belief and understanding that persist in the collective unconscious, regardless of official ideology or educational instruction. Younger generations in rural areas demonstrate a complex relationship with Domovoi beliefs that resists simple categorization as either retention or abandonment of traditional worldviews. A woman in her 30s, educated in the city and employed in a modern profession, may dismiss the Domovoi as folklore when conversing with urban friends, yet find herself speaking respectfully to the spirit when alone in her ancestral home, leaving offerings and maintaining practices that she cannot rationally justify, but that she also cannot bring herself to abandon. This internal contradiction reflects not intellectual confusion, but rather the coexistence of multiple frameworks for understanding reality. The rational, secular framework acquired through formal education and modern socialization, and the intuitive, traditional framework activated through embodied experience within the home and through the weight of family practice and expectation. The Domovoi occupies a space that transcends the simple binary between belief and disbelief, existing instead in the complex territory where personal experience, family continuity, and the irreducible mystery of household phenomena interact to generate a pragmatic acknowledgement of the spirit's relevance, regardless of one's conscious intellectual commitments. The phenomenon of Domovoi-related beliefs persisting among rural populations who have experienced significant modernization and education suggests that certain aspects of the tradition fulfill psychological and social functions that alternative worldviews cannot adequately replace. In a world characterized by increasing uncertainty and the dissolution of traditional certainties, the Domovoi offers a framework for understanding domestic phenomena and for maintaining a sense of agency and control within one's immediate environment. The ability to address household problems through offerings and ritual modification of behavior provides psychological benefits that the modern alternative, accepting randomness and the operation of impersonal physical laws, cannot match. The Domovoi also serves a crucial function in maintaining family cohesion and transmitting values across generations. The teaching of proper household conduct being inseparable from the teaching of Domovoi, related traditions and prohibitions. Through the perpetuation of these traditions, families maintain connection to their own history and cultural identity, anchoring themselves to something that transcends individual existence and connects them to generations of ancestors who inhabited the same dwellings and served the same supernatural guardian. Regional variation in the intensity of Domovoi belief and practice reflects differing degrees of isolation, economic development, and maintenance of traditional agricultural practices, rather than suggesting that the tradition has weakened uniformly across all of rural Russia. In the most remote areas, particularly in northern regions where winters remain severe and where traditional patterns of life have changed minimally despite official modernization, the Domovoi remains a significant presence in household consciousness and daily practice. Villages slightly more integrated into modern economic systems maintain the traditions with somewhat less intensity. Those specific practices, the leaving of bread and milk, the avoidance of whistling, the careful maintenance of the stove area, persist even among those who express skepticism about supernatural causation. Urban residents with rural origins frequently report that while they do not maintain Domovoi-related practices in their modern apartments, they experience something approaching compulsion to resume these practices when visiting ancestral homes in rural areas, as if the space itself reactivates traditional patterns of understanding and behavior. The adaptation of Domovoi traditions to contemporary circumstances reveals the flexibility and resilience of these beliefs, while simultaneously demonstrating how they maintain fundamental continuity with historical practices. Modern families may leave offerings in updated locations, a kitchen counter rather than behind an old-fashioned stove, yet the essential practice of acknowledging the spirit through food, provision, remains unchanged. Contemporary households may employ modern explanations for phenomena traditionally attributed to the Domovoi, describing incidents in terms of psychological stress or coincidence, rather than supernatural intervention, yet they often simultaneously take practical actions based on traditional understanding. A mother worried about her child's unexplained illness might visit a modern clinic for medical evaluation, but she may also leave offerings to the Domovoi and avoid whistling in the house, hedging her bets by maintaining engagement with both frameworks simultaneously. This pragmatic pluralism suggests that the Domovoi persists not despite modernization, but rather because the tradition proves flexible enough to coexist with alternative worldviews, without requiring explicit rejection of scientific understanding. The transmission of Domovoi-related knowledge across generations has become increasingly fragmented and inconsistent in regions experiencing rapid modernization. Yet even this fragmented transmission preserves the essential core beliefs and practices. A child may not receive systematic instruction in the full complexity of Domovoi tradition, yet they will absorb through osmosis and observation certain key practices and prohibitions. Grandmothers in particular serve as custodians of this knowledge, ensuring that younger family members, even those who are skeptical or ambivalent about supernatural belief, receive sufficient exposure to traditional practices that they can reasonably recreate them when circumstances activate their relevance. The gender of this knowledge transmission, with elder women typically serving as primary teachers, reflects historical patterns of how household knowledge has been organized within family structures and ensures that the traditions remain embedded within family relationships rather than being formalized into external institutions that might be more easily displaced by modernization. As we emerge from our extended journey through the mythology of the Domovoi, from the initial threshold of understanding through the complex labyrinth of his protective functions, his terrible punishments, his sacred prohibitions, and his continued presence in the contemporary Russian consciousness, we find ourselves confronting a figure whose significance transcends the boundaries of folklore and enters the territory of universal human truth. The Domovoi is not merely a creature of Russian superstition or an antiquated belief system suitable only for anthropological study, but rather the embodiment of something fundamental about the human relationship to domestic space and the invisible forces that govern the stability and well-being of the places we call home. To understand the Domovoi fully is to understand that our homes are not neutral containers for human activity, but rather complex psychological and spiritual spaces that demand respect, that reward propriety with protection, and that punish negligence and disrespect with consequences that extend far beyond the merely material. The spirit is, in its essence, a representation of home itself, a manifestation of the household's consciousness, its values, its standards, and its fundamental commitment to the welfare of all beings sheltered within its walls. The duality that characterizes the Domovoi, his simultaneous capacity for protection and punishment, for blessing and curse, for benevolence and terrible wrath, reflects the essential duality of home itself as a place of safety that simultaneously demands strict adherence to standards and proper conduct. The safety that home provides is not unconditional or permanent, but rather contingent upon the maintenance of order, respect, and propriety. A home abandoned by those who inhabit it, where standards collapse and chaos begins to penetrate the walls, becomes transformed from a sanctuary into a place of danger. Yet a home maintained with care, organized with thought, and treated with reverence becomes a fortress against the chaos of the external world, a space where families can grow, where children can develop secure attachments, and where individuals can find refuge from the hostility and unpredictability that characterizes existence beyond the threshold. The Domovoi embodies this transformation, functioning as the guardian and the enforcer, the protector and the judge, ensuring through the mechanisms of his presence and his potential intervention that homes maintain their essential character as spaces of stability and security. The Domovoi's persistence across centuries, his survival through the transformation from pagan Slavic societies to Orthodox Christian ones, through the upheavals of modernization and industrialization, and through the official rejection of supernatural belief during the Soviet era, testifies to something more profound than mere cultural stubbornness or the conservative resistance of rural populations to change. The spirit persists because the problems he addresses remain eternally relevant to human existence. The anxiety about household security, the fear that the places we shelter in might become hostile or unsafe, the concern that our efforts at maintaining order might fail, and the persistent experience of phenomena that resist rational explanation continue to activate the psychological frameworks that the Domovoi represents. In each generation, individuals living within homes discover that certain experiences cannot be adequately explained through purely rational mechanisms, and they reach back into the traditional frameworks available to them, finding in the Domovoi a conceptual tool that provides meaning to the inexplicable and agency in the face of mysterious phenomena. Within the broader landscape of Slavic folklore and mythology, the Domovoi occupies a position of particular intimacy and psychological relevance, distinct from the more remote or exotic creatures that populate the supernatural narratives of the region. While the Rusalka emerges from waters to seduce the unwary and the Leshy guards the deep forests with alien hostility, the Domovoi dwells in the place most central to human experience, the home itself. He is not a being encountered on dangerous journeys or in liminal wilderness spaces, but rather a presence that intersects with daily life, with the mundane activities through which families sustain themselves, and with the intimate moments when individuals are most vulnerable and most dependent upon the protection that their dwelling provides. This proximity and relevance distinguish the Domovoi from other supernatural entities and explain why, despite the availability of more exotic and dramatic creatures within Slavic tradition, the household spirit remains the most psychologically resonant and the most deeply embedded in folk consciousness. The Domovoi also embodies universal anxieties about domestic space that transcend the specific cultural context of Russia or Slavic civilization. Every human culture has developed mythology around household spirits or domestic guardians, suggesting that certain fundamental aspects of how humans relate to their dwellings remain consistent across cultural boundaries. The Japanese kami of the hearth, the Roman household gods, the Germanic Hausgeist, and countless other traditions across human civilization all point to a universal recognition that homes are inhabited by more than merely the physical bodies of family members. Something about the accumulation of human activity within a space, something about the concentration of emotional intensity and familial bonds, something about the extension of human intention and effort into the maintenance of a dwelling seems to generate a perceived presence, an invisible inhabitant that watches and judges in response to conduct. The Domovoi represents one culturally specific manifestation of a universal human perception about the of domestic space. To comprehend the Domovoi in his fullest complexity is to recognize that he functions simultaneously as folklore, as psychological principle, as cultural transmitter of values, and as genuine supernatural experience. These categories need not be understood as mutually exclusive, and the attempt to resolve the Domovoi into any single dimension risks losing the essential insight that the figure encodes. He operates as folklore in the sense that stories about him are transmitted through cultural channels and shaped by narrative conventions. He functions as a psychological principle in that he represents genuine psychological experiences and emotional realities. He serves as a cultural transmitter in that belief in and practice related to him shapes behavior and transmits values. And he may well constitute genuine supernatural experience for those who encounter him. The Domovoi cannot be reduced to any single level of analysis without loss of explanatory power, and without diminishing the figure's actual significance in human consciousness and in the lived experience of those who acknowledge his presence. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable being, we arrive at a recognition that the Domovoi represents humanity's attempt to externalize and give form to the invisible forces that govern domestic welfare and household stability. He embodies the recognition that homes demand respect, that negligence and disorder have genuine consequences, that the maintenance of proper standards creates conditions for flourishing while their violation generates suffering. He represents the understanding that something more than mere physical structure holds families together, that invisible bonds of obligation and mutual care create spaces of security within which children can grow and individuals can find refuge. The Domovoi is ultimately a reflection that gazes back at us from the threshold between the visible and invisible worlds, showing us that the home we inhabit is simultaneously a physical structure and a sacred space, a practical shelter and a spiritual domain, a refuge we take for granted and a source of mystery we have never fully comprehended. If this exploration of the Domovoi and his multifaceted significance has resonated with you, if the stories and insights we have shared have illuminated aspects of your own relationship to home and domestic space, I invite you to continue this journey by subscribing to Echoes of the Old World. We remain committed to bringing you deeper explorations of the spirits, entities, and beliefs that have shaped human consciousness across centuries and continents. Each episode is crafted to unveil the hidden truths encoded within folklore, to examine how ancient peoples understood the invisible forces that govern existence, and to demonstrate that these traditions remain as relevant today as they were generations ago. Your subscription ensures that you will not miss a single revelation about the spiritual dimensions of human existence that our ancestors knew and that we are only beginning to rediscover.